When Chuck Norris walked into an upscale restaurant, his appearance immediately drew ridicule from the staff. The waitress decided that he was not worthy of good service and did everything she could to make him feel inappropriate. What happened next made all the guests freeze in shock. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. Le Magnifique stood at the heart of the city, an oasis of exclusivity where only the elite dined. This was no ordinary restaurant. It was a statement, a declaration of status and wealth, the kind of place where simply securing a reservation was a challenge, and walking through its grand entrance meant stepping into a world where appearances mattered more than character. Crystal chandeliers cast their golden glow over imported Italian marble, reflecting off the immaculately polished surfaces of rare antique tables. Soft jazz played in the background, blending seamlessly with the low murmur of hushed conversations. The scent of aged wine, seared Wagyu beef, and exotic truffle sauces lingered in the air, weaving an intoxicating promise of indulgence. The guests who entered did so with a practiced grace, their attire curated to perfection. Women in flowing designer gowns, men in tailored suits, each accessory a deliberate choice to reinforce their presence among society's most privileged. Every aspect of Le Magnifique exuded wealth and exclusivity, and those who worked there ensured that nothing disturbed that delicate balance. Standing at the front, near the grand mahogany reception desk, was Elizabeth, the restaurant's hostess. She was young, poised, and impossibly polished, with a trained smile that could shift between warmth and icy indifference depending on whom she was greeting. She had long mastered the art of silent judgment, an essential skill in a place like this. Those who belonged were greeted with charm and effortless grace. Those who did not were subtly directed toward the periphery, as far away from the center of the action as possible. Behind her, Amanda, one of the senior waitresses, adjusted her pristine uniform. She was even more ruthless than Elizabeth when it came to maintaining the restaurant's unspoken hierarchy. Her sharp eyes scanned every guest, assessing them in an instant, deciding who deserved extra attention and who could be ignored without consequence. To Amanda, wealth wasn't just a measure of success, it was a measure of worth. Then the restaurant doors opened again, and a lone figure stepped inside. The man was tall, his movements unhurried, his presence calm but commanding in a way that was almost unnatural. He wore a simple denim jacket, a slightly faded plaid shirt underneath, and well-worn boots that had seen more roads than most of the guests here ever would. His face was chiseled, lined with experience rather than vanity, and his piercing eyes swept across the room with quiet assessment. He did not look around nervously, nor did he seem concerned about the judgmental glances that immediately flickered in his direction. The moment Elizabeth saw him, her smile faltered, only for a fraction of a second, but enough for Amanda to notice. It wasn't just his appearance, it was the way he carried himself, with an ease that defied the unspoken rules of a place like Le Magnifique. He wasn't trying to prove anything, he wasn't intimidated, and that, more than anything, unsettled her. The whispers began almost instantly. A few guests exchanged knowing looks, their expressions ranging from mild amusement to outright disdain. A woman in an emerald silk dress leaned closer to her companion, murmuring something behind a delicate hand. A businessman at the bar raised an eyebrow, his smirk just barely hidden behind his whiskey glass. Elizabeth hesitated for the briefest moment before regaining her composure. Then, with the same well-practiced professionalism she extended to all guests, no matter how out of place they seemed, she spoke. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice measured, polite, but devoid of the warmth she reserved for the restaurant's usual clientele. "Do you have a reservation?" The man met her gaze, his eyes steady. "No." The single word, spoken with such casual confidence, sent another ripple through the room. No reservation, and yet he had walked in as though he owned the place. Elizabeth exchanged a quick glance with Amanda, who barely concealed her smirk. "We're fully booked tonight," Elizabeth said smoothly, though there were still a handful of empty tables visible. The man didn't argue. He didn't plead or make excuses. He simply waited. Something about the way he stood there, unwavering, made Elizabeth shift uncomfortably. For reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself glancing at the reservation list as though some part of her expected to find his name there. "Give him the back table," Amanda murmured, just low enough for Elizabeth to hear. "By the kitchen." Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. "Right this way," she said, turning sharply on her heel. She led him through the grand dining area, past tables adorned with gold-rimmed china and expensive silverware. Conversations softened as he passed, eyes lingering on him longer than necessary, some with amusement, some with mild curiosity, but most with that same unspoken message: "You don't belong here." Elizabeth reached the farthest corner of the restaurant, where the elegant lighting gave way to dim shadows, where the scent of seared meats mingled with the faint traces of dish soap from the kitchen doors. She gestured to a small, unremarkable table with 2 chairs. "This should suit you just fine," she said with a saccharine smile. The man glanced at the table, then at the restaurant around him. If he noticed the intentional slight, he gave no indication. Instead, he simply nodded and took his seat. Elizabeth turned sharply, striding back toward the main floor where Amanda was already waiting, arms crossed. "Well?" Amanda asked, voice laced with amusement. Elizabeth exhaled. He didn't argue. "Of course he didn't," Amanda scoffed. "Men like that know their place." Neither of them noticed the way a few guests at nearby tables exchanged glances, people who had spent their lives learning to recognize something few others did. They weren't looking at his clothes. They weren't focused on his lack of a reservation. They were looking at his posture, at the way he sat without shrinking into the background, without showing the slightest trace of discomfort. One older gentleman in a crisp navy suit, seated at a prime table in the center of the restaurant, swirled his wineglass thoughtfully. "That," he murmured to his wife, "is a man who's seen more than most of these people ever will." His wife, elegant and poised, followed his gaze toward the farthest table. She studied the man for a moment, then turned back to her husband with an intrigued smile. "I wonder," she mused, "if they realize what they've just done." At that moment, Amanda walked past the man's table, deliberately ignoring him. She didn't offer water, didn't ask if he needed anything. She wanted him to feel it, to know he was beneath their attention. But he simply sat there, waiting, watching. And something about the way he did made her uneasy. The night had only just begun. The restaurant carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. The clinking of glasses, the murmured conversations, the soft hum of jazz in the background, all continued undisturbed. Yet, for those who had noticed the man seated near the kitchen, an underlying tension had begun to ripple through the air. He had been placed deliberately at the worst table in the restaurant, yet he sat with the presence of someone who had chosen it himself. No discomfort, no irritation, no attempt to protest the way he had been treated. Amanda, the senior waitress, took this as a silent victory. She had seen men like him before, wanderers, drifters, those who had somehow stumbled into places they didn't belong. And in a place like Le Magnifique, belonging was everything. She strode past his table without acknowledging him, letting her presence be felt without offering the basic courtesy of service. It was an unspoken test, a subtle challenge. How long would he sit there before realizing that he had no business staying? Minutes passed, then more. The man remained where he was, his eyes calmly scanning the room. He wasn't looking for attention, nor did he seem impatient. If anything, he looked curious, as if he was studying the way things unfolded around him, observing something beyond what others could see. Amanda felt a flicker of annoyance. He was supposed to be uncomfortable by now. He was supposed to fidget, to look uncertain, to check his watch or clear his throat to signal impatience. Instead, he just sat there, entirely at ease. At last she approached, her steps slow and deliberate. She carried only a single menu, one specifically curated for less important guests. No wine list, no premium selections, just a narrow selection of the simplest appetizers and entrees. She placed it in front of him without a word. The man glanced at it, then slowly picked it up. He turned the pages without haste, scanning the sparse offerings as though it made no difference to him. Amanda crossed her arms, waiting. Finally, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "I'll have the filet mignon with truffle sauce," he said. A flicker of amusement crossed Amanda's face. It was the most expensive item on the menu, a dish meant for real guests, the kind who didn't hesitate to pair it with a $1,000 bottle of wine. "Are you sure?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, her tone dripping with doubt. The man simply nodded. Amanda held his gaze for a moment, searching for hesitation, for any indication that he might reconsider. She found none. Fine. Let him see what he was getting himself into. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, taking her time. She wasn't about to rush for him. As she passed Elizabeth, the hostess, she smirked. "You won't believe what he just ordered." Elizabeth barely looked up from the reservation book. "Let me guess, the most expensive thing on the menu?" Amanda chuckled. "Of course. It's always the same with these types. They think ordering something pricey makes them belong." Elizabeth glanced toward the far table, where the man sat calmly, waiting. "Let's see if he even stays long enough to get his meal," she said. The two women shared a quiet laugh before Amanda disappeared into the kitchen. Meanwhile, the restaurant's other guests continued to steal glances at the stranger, some with mild curiosity, others with open amusement. A man in a tailored suit shook his head with a smirk. "He'll leave before dessert," he muttered to his companion. At a nearby table, a young woman named Lisa, a sharp-eyed entrepreneur, observed the scene with a different perspective. Unlike most of the guests, she didn't see a man out of place. She saw a man in complete control of himself, and that, more than anything, intrigued her. She leaned slightly toward her dining partner. "Why does he seem so calm?" Her companion, a well-dressed financier, shrugged. "He probably doesn't realize how out of place he is." Lisa wasn't convinced. There was something about the man's demeanor that didn't fit the assumptions being made about him. She decided to keep watching. Across the restaurant, an older gentleman named Mr. Carter, a distinguished figure with silver hair and sharp eyes, also took notice. He sipped his wine slowly, observing the unfolding situation with quiet interest. His wife, seated beside him, picked up on his expression. "You've noticed him too," she murmured. Mr. Carter nodded slightly. "There's something different about him." His wife followed his gaze, watching as the man remained perfectly composed, unaffected by the clear attempts to make him uncomfortable. "What do you think he's waiting for?" she asked. Mr. Carter set down his glass. "He's waiting to see who they are." Back in the kitchen, Amanda leaned against the counter, making no hurry to place the man's order. She chatted briefly with another server, pretending to check a list while letting time drag on. Finally, after a deliberate delay, she passed the order to the chef. "Table 26, she said carelessly. The chef barely glanced up. "That's the far corner, isn't it?" Amanda smirked. "Don't rush." The chef chuckled. "Got it." Back on the restaurant floor, Amanda continued her little game. She attended to other tables, lingering longer than necessary with wealthy guests, ensuring they had everything they needed. She smiled, laughed, offered wine recommendations, all while completely ignoring the man in the corner. At one point, she walked past his table again without stopping. She wanted to see if he would react, if he would shift in his seat, glance around for a server, signal for attention. But he didn't. Instead, he simply watched. And that, more than anything, made Amanda uneasy. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. By now, even some of the guests had begun to notice the obvious neglect. A woman at a nearby table whispered to her partner, shaking her head, "He hasn't been served anything." Her partner, a well-dressed man in his 40s, shrugged. "Maybe they're hoping he'll leave." Lisa, still observing from a distance, exhaled slowly. "He's waiting," she murmured to herself. Her companion raised an eyebrow. Waiting for what? Lisa didn't answer, but she had a feeling that whatever this man was doing, he wasn't just a lost customer hoping for a meal. At the center of the restaurant, Mr. Carter leaned forward slightly, watching as the scene unfolded. "He's patient," he said softly. His wife gave him a curious look. "So?" Mr. Carter smiled faintly. "Most people would have left by now." As if on cue, Amanda finally returned to the kitchen and retrieved the delayed order. With slow, deliberate movements, she placed the steaming plate on a tray and strode back toward the farthest table. She placed it down with just a little too much force, the sound of the plate hitting the table cutting through the quiet murmur of the restaurant. "There you go," she said, her voice laced with artificial sweetness. The man looked at the dish in front of him, then at her. He didn't say anything. He just smiled. And for the first time that evening, Amanda felt something she hadn't expected. Doubt. The scent of seared filet mignon mixed with the earthy richness of truffle sauce, wafting into the air as the dish was placed before him. The steak, a true signature of Le Magnifique, was a culinary masterpiece, tender, precisely cooked, plated with artistic perfection. Amanda stood by the table, watching, waiting. She didn't just want him to eat. She didn't just want him to eat. She wanted him to falter, to hesitate, to betray even the slightest discomfort at being in a place where he so clearly didn't belong. But he didn't. He sat there, calm, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he reached for the knife. The murmurs in the restaurant had softened into a collective silence, a pause in the usual rhythm of Le Magnifique. People were watching. The moment the blade met the meat, something changed. With a single effortless stroke, he sliced through the steak. Not with force, not with struggle. Just a slow, controlled motion that sent the cut piece gliding to the side of the plate with absolute precision. It was the kind of movement that suggested not just skill, but mastery. The subtle gasps were almost imperceptible, but they were there. A few guests blinked, taken aback. One man at a nearby table, someone who prided himself on his knife skills, stared, his fingers unconsciously tightening around his own silverware. Amanda stiffened. It was a small thing, a simple action, but something about it unsettled her. The man took his fork, lifted the piece of steak, and placed it in his mouth, chewing slowly. Not as if he were judging the meal, not as if he were savoring something rare. He ate as if it was just another moment in a long string of moments, as natural and ordinary as breathing, and somehow that made it even more unsettling. Across the restaurant, Lisa had been watching closely. She hadn't expected much when she first noticed him. Like everyone else, she had assumed he was just another man in the wrong place, a misguided visitor who would soon realize his mistake and leave. But she saw something now. It was in his body language, in the way he moved, the way he handled his knife, the way he didn't react to the subtle taunts and humiliations. This wasn't a man who stumbled into places he didn't belong. This was a man who didn't believe in the concept of not belonging at all. Her companion had noticed it too. That was smooth, he muttered. Lisa nodded slightly. Too smooth. Meanwhile, at the central table, Mr. Carter had been watching as well. He swirled his wine slowly, a knowing glint in his eyes. "He's done that before," he murmured to his wife. She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The way he handled that knife," Carter said, "that wasn't an ordinary cut. That was someone who knows control, precision. That's not a man intimidated by wealth or setting. That's a man who studied discipline his whole life." His wife studied him for a moment, then turned back toward the man in the corner, and then, slowly, it clicked. "That's him," she whispered. Carter's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Amanda hadn't caught on yet. She was still standing there, watching him eat, her hands lightly gripping the edge of her tray. His lack of reaction was throwing her off balance. She had expected some sign of discomfort, some indication that he felt the weight of how he had been treated tonight. Instead, he simply continued eating, unbothered. She needed to push further. "Enjoying your meal?" she asked, her tone laced with artificial sweetness. She was hoping for hesitation, an awkward stumble in his response. But he just nodded, wiping his mouth with the napkin. "Good," Amanda said, her smile thin. "It's not every day someone like you gets to experience something this refined." That was it. The moment of challenge, the final attempt to shake him, to push him toward an emotional reaction. And he did react, but not in the way she had expected. He looked at her, not sharply, not aggressively, just looked. And suddenly, Amanda felt something she hadn't expected to feel tonight. Unease. There was no hostility in his gaze, no anger, but there was something beneath the surface. Something unreadable. And that, more than anything, unnerved her. She turned quickly, stepping away from the table, her grip tightening around the tray. She didn't understand why she felt unsettled, only that she did. She moved toward the other tables, shaking off the sensation. At the central table, Carter exhaled slowly. "She just realized it," he murmured. His wife glanced at him, realized what? Carter took a sip of his wine, eyes never leaving the man in the corner. "She's been testing him all night," he said, "and now she knows. He's been testing her back." Lisa, at her own table, had reached the same conclusion. "This whole night," she whispered. "He's been watching, studying them, letting them show exactly who they are." Her companion frowned. "So you're saying he's playing them?" Lisa shook her head. "No," she said. "He's letting them play themselves." At that moment, Amanda stood near the service counter, gripping the tray tightly. She took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling creeping up her spine. Jake, another waiter, gave her a curious glance. "What's with you?" he asked. Amanda exhaled, forcing a casual smirk. Nothing, just a weird night. Jake followed her gaze toward the far table, where the man had nearly finished his meal. He raised an eyebrow. "What's his deal?" Amanda hesitated, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. "I don't know," she muttered, "but I think we just made a mistake." At that moment, the man in the corner set down his knife and fork, dabbing his mouth once more with the napkin. Then he lifted his gaze, looking toward the front of the restaurant. And, as if the universe had been waiting for that very moment, something shifted. Because at that exact second, the restaurant doors opened once more, and the manager of Le Magnifique stepped inside. His eyes swept over the dining room, first toward the elegant guests, then toward his staff. And finally, they landed on the man seated in the corner. And when they did, his entire demeanor changed. The shift was instant. His professional composure cracked. His expression flickered with something between recognition and immediate regret. And then, in a move that sent shockwaves through everyone watching, the manager, a man who had never once shown deference to anyone, straightened his jacket, hurriedly approached the farthest table, and bowed. "Sir," he said, voice tight with respect, "I had no idea you were coming tonight." Silence fell over Le Magnifique. Amanda felt her stomach drop. The guests watched, frozen. Lisa inhaled sharply. Mr. Carter smiled. And the man in the corner? He simply picked up his glass, took a sip of water, and waited for the rest of the world to catch up. A hush had fallen over Le Magnifique, a silence so profound that even the soft strains of the jazz trio in the corner seemed distant, muffled by the weight of unspoken realization. The manager, a man known for his composure, his impeccable control over every facet of the restaurant's operation, stood before the farthest table, his posture betraying an unease that had never been seen before. Amanda, still gripping her tray, felt the room tilt slightly, as if reality itself had shifted beneath her feet. She had spent the evening entertaining a game of quiet superiority, certain that the man before her was nothing more than an intruder, a transient figure who had stumbled into a place he didn't belong. And yet, in a matter of seconds, that certainty had been shattered. The manager, Gregory Thompson, a man who prided himself on recognizing power and influence the moment it entered his establishment, was bowing. Not just inclining his head in polite acknowledgement, but offering the kind of deferential tilt that one reserved for those who existed beyond the reach of ordinary men. "Sir," Thompson said again, his voice carefully measured, though edged with something almost akin to fear. "I had no idea you were dining with us this evening." The man at the table, the one who had endured the pointed glances, the deliberate neglect, the whispered laughter, simply placed his glass down and regarded the manager with the same calm gaze he had maintained all night. For a moment, no one spoke. A ripple of understanding spread through the room as realization settled upon the guests, threading its way through each table like an unspoken confession. A murmur, tentative at first, then growing, passed among the patrons, faces turning toward the far table with expressions that ranged from shock to sudden, nervous awe. Amanda felt the blood drain from her face. She had spent the night testing him. She had done everything short of explicitly telling him he wasn't welcome. And now she understood. She wasn't testing him. He had been testing them. The manager, regaining some semblance of composure, straightened his jacket and gestured subtly to the nearest server, who rushed forward with a fresh linen napkin and a silver tray, as if to erase the previous hour of indignities with swift, practiced grace. "Please," Thompson continued, his voice adjusting to a smoother, more reverential tone. "Allow me to personally ensure that your evening is—" The man lifted a hand, a small, simple gesture that stopped the manager mid-sentence. "I've had what I came for," he said, his voice quiet yet firm, carrying the kind of weight that did not require elevation. Thompson hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to press further or step away, caught between the instinct to rectify his oversight and the knowledge that the damage had already been done. Slowly, deliberately, the man reached forward and turned over the bill that had been placed on the table, its pristine white surface unmarred by ink. He picked up the silver pen that had been laid beside it and, with a steady hand, began to write. Amanda watched, unable to breathe, her fingers gripping the tray so tightly that her knuckles turned white. When he finished, he placed the pen down, folded the bill neatly, and set it at the center of the table. Then, with the same unhurried composure, he rose to his feet. The movement itself was simple, but its effect was seismic. Thompson took an instinctive step back. The guests, who had spent the evening treating the man as little more than an oddity, now regarded him with the same quiet reverence they reserved for the city's most powerful figures. Amanda wanted to shrink into the floor, to disappear, to undo every moment that had led her here. But it was too late. The man turned, walking with slow, deliberate steps toward the entrance. Each footfall was steady, unhurried, the kind that left an imprint not on the polished marble floor, but on the memory of those who watched. The doors of Le Magnifique opened, the cool night air slipping in as he stepped out into the darkness beyond. Only when the doors had closed behind him did someone finally move. It was Thompson. He reached forward, picked up the bill, and carefully unfolded it. The silence stretched. Then he inhaled sharply. Amanda could see the words written in neat, unhurried script. "Tonight, every guest in this restaurant dines at my expense. The only price they must pay is respect." For a long moment, there was no sound, no movement, no reaction. Then, at the center of the room, an older gentleman, Mr. Carter, who had observed the evening with the patient wisdom of someone who had seen the world in all its forms, set down his wineglass and began to clap. It was slow at first, a deliberate, measured applause. Then another guest joined, and another. And suddenly, the restaurant that had spent the evening casting judgment upon the man now found itself acknowledging a lesson it had not expected to receive. Amanda stood frozen, her tray trembling in her hands. She had been so certain of her own power, so sure that she had been the one in control of the evening's narrative. But she understood now. It had never been her test. It had been his, and she had failed. The applause faded slowly, not into silence, but into something heavier, a quiet awareness, a collective realization that lingered in the air like the final note of a symphony. The weight of what had just happened settled over the restaurant, pressing down on the carefully constructed world of Le Magnifique, forcing it to acknowledge the cracks in its foundation. Gregory Thompson, the restaurant's manager, still held the bill in his hands, his fingers gripping the edges as if anchoring himself in the moment. He read the words again, his throat tightening. The handwriting was firm, deliberate, unhurried, just like the man who had written them. "Tonight, every guest in this restaurant dines at my expense. The only price they must pay is respect." A sentence so simple, yet heavier than the most extravagant meal Le Magnifique had ever served. For the first time in his long career, Thompson felt the sting of shame, not from an error in service or a dissatisfied guest, but from something deeper, a recognition that the values he had upheld so rigidly had been tested and found lacking. The room remained still, though the energy had shifted. The guests, many of whom had spent the evening indulging in whispered judgments, now exchanged looks that ranged from embarrassment to contemplation. Some glanced toward the exit, as if half expecting the man to return, as if hoping for an opportunity to rewrite their role in the evening's unfolding story. At a corner table, Lisa exhaled, setting her glass down. That was... She paused, shaking her head slightly. That was something else. Her companion, who had spent the night assuming the worst of the man, swallowed hard, his confidence shaken. Who was he? Lisa didn't answer. Instead, she looked across the room to Mr. Carter, the older gentleman who had been watching the evening's events with quiet understanding. Mr. Carter was still seated, his expression unreadable, his fingers resting lightly against the rim of his wine glass. His wife, sitting beside him, finally broke the silence. "Well," she murmured, "this certainly wasn't just another evening." Mr. Carter allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "No," he said, "it was something much more." Across the room, Amanda stood frozen near the service counter, her entire body rigid with the weight of realization. The smug confidence she had carried throughout the night had evaporated, leaving behind something she didn't recognize. A hollow pit formed in her stomach. The man was gone, but the consequences of what had happened remained. She had prided herself on her ability to assess people, to know, within seconds, who was worth her time and who was not. She had been certain, so certain, that she understood him, that she knew exactly the kind of man he was. And yet, standing there now, she understood the truth. She had been blind. Slowly, she turned her gaze toward Thompson, waiting for him to speak, for him to issue some command, some instruction that would return normalcy to the evening. But, for the first time since she had known him, Thompson looked lost. He exhaled, setting the bill down on the counter before rubbing his temple as if trying to erase the headache forming behind his eyes. Amanda forced herself to move, though her limbs felt heavy. She approached cautiously, her voice quieter than she had ever allowed it to be in this restaurant. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "should we do something?" Thompson looked at her then, and Amanda felt an unfamiliar flicker of discomfort beneath his gaze. "Yes," he said after a long pause. "We should, but not what you think." Before Amanda could question him, he straightened, his professional mask slipping back into place, though she could see the fracture lines now, the fine cracks in his certainty. Then, with an air of finality, he turned to the staff who had gathered, watching, waiting for direction. "Close the restaurant early," he said. "Tell the guests their meals are taken care of, but don't rush them out." A murmur of surprise rippled through the employees. Amanda stiffened. "Close early?" Thompson's gaze darkened as he looked at her. "Yes, and then we have a staff meeting." Amanda's stomach turned. She didn't need to ask what it would be about. The rest of the evening unfolded in a strange haze. Guests finished their meals, some leaving hurriedly, as if trying to escape the shadow of their own behavior, others lingering, lost in thought. The atmosphere had changed, subtly but undeniably. By the time the last diner departed and the heavy doors of Le Magnifique were locked for the night, the staff gathered in the main dining hall. The grand chandeliers still glowed overhead, but the usual warmth of their golden light felt different now, harsher, less forgiving. Amanda stood near the edge of the group, arms crossed, though she wasn't sure if it was out of defiance or an attempt to hold herself together. Thompson paced for a moment, running a hand through his hair before finally turning to face them all. "You all saw what happened tonight," he said, his voice steady, though the usual authority behind it felt subdued. "You all felt it." No one spoke. Amanda clenched her jaw. She wanted to look away, to pretend that she wasn't the focal point of this conversation, but she knew better. Thompson let the silence stretch before continuing. "We've prided ourselves on being an elite establishment," he said. "We've built our reputation on exclusivity, on catering to a specific clientele." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the staff. "But tonight, we saw what happens when that philosophy is taken too far." Amanda felt her pulse quicken. Thompson exhaled. "I don't expect anyone here to change overnight," he said, "but I do expect everyone to learn from this. Because, let me be clear, what happened tonight was a test." He let that settle. "And we failed." A weight pressed down on Amanda's chest. She had failed, and there was no undoing it. For the first time, she wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't even humiliated. She was ashamed. Thompson turned his attention directly to her then, and for once she didn't look away. "You've been one of my best employees, Amanda," he said, "but tonight you showed me something I can't ignore." Her throat tightened. She swallowed hard. "I know," she said quietly. Thompson studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I'm not firing you," he said, "but I am telling you this. If you can't change, you won't last here." Amanda didn't argue, because for the first time she understood. She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Thompson exhaled, then turned back to the rest of the staff. "From this point forward, this restaurant isn't just about exclusivity. It's about excellence. And excellence doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from respect." The staff absorbed his words, some nodding, others looking away, lost in their own thoughts. And then, just like that, the meeting was over. Amanda remained in place as the others dispersed, her feet rooted to the floor. Tonight had changed something in her. And she knew, whether she liked it or not, she would never be the same again. The night air was cool, crisp with the quiet hum of the city beyond the grand doors of Le Magnifique. The restaurant stood still now, its extravagant chandeliers dimmed, its polished floors reflecting only the empty silence left behind by the evening's events. Inside, the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air, an invisible imprint on those who had witnessed it. Amanda remained seated at one of the tables, staring at nothing in particular. The reality of the night pressed down on her, heavier than any judgment she had ever cast. She had spent years believing she understood the world, convinced that status and refinement were the truest markers of worth. And yet, a single man, a man she had dismissed without a second thought, had unraveled that belief in mere hours. She wasn't alone in her thoughts. Across the room, Lisa lingered near the bar, her arms crossed, watching the last of the staff quietly shuffle away. She hadn't expected to witness something like this tonight. She had dined at Le Magnifique more times than she could count, but never had a meal ended with such an undeniable shift in perspective. Her companion from earlier had already left, eager to retreat from an evening that had made him uncomfortable. But Lisa had stayed. She felt compelled to, as if something about this night needed to settle properly before she could walk away. Near the center of the restaurant, Mr. Carter finished the last sip of his wine before setting his glass down with deliberate care. His wife, always composed, studied him thoughtfully. "Thinking of saying something?" she asked. He offered a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps." His gaze drifted toward Amanda, who still hadn't moved. Lisa followed his line of sight and exhaled softly. I don't think she'll be the same after tonight." Carter nodded. "None of us will." Silence settled between them for a moment before Carter finally rose to his feet. He walked toward the reception area where Gregory Thompson stood, arms folded, his usual controlled demeanor replaced by something more pensive. The two men regarded each other for a moment before Carter spoke. "You know," he said, "I've eaten in this restaurant for years. Always thought I understood the kind of place it was." Thompson exhaled, shaking his head. "And now?" Carter smiled slightly. "Now I realize I was wrong." Thompson chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Join the club." For a moment, there was nothing but quiet between them. Then, Carter's expression grew thoughtful. He didn't say much, he mused, but he didn't have to. Thompson nodded. No, he didn't. Lisa finally approached, her heels clicking lightly against the marble floor. She hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "Who do you think he really was?" she asked. Thompson glanced toward the empty table where the man had sat, his fingers drumming lightly against his arm. "Someone who doesn't need to prove anything," he said. Lisa thought about that for a moment. And yet, he did. Carter chuckled softly. That's the thing about people like him. Their presence alone is enough. The three of them stood in thoughtful silence before Carter finally reached into his pocket and placed a crisp bill on the counter. "For the staff," he said simply. A reminder that lessons like tonight don't come for free. Thompson nodded in thanks, though they both knew the real payment had already been made. Lisa turned back towards the dining area, her gaze settling on Amanda one last time. She could see the weight in the young woman's posture, the quiet reflection in her face. She didn't need to say anything. Amanda had already learned her lesson. The city, outside, pulsed on, unaware of what had unfolded behind the grand doors of Le Magnifique. But for those who had been inside, something had changed. It wasn't just about a meal, or a mistake, or a single moment of realization. It was about something far greater. It was about respect. It was about understanding. And above all, it was about the kind of power that doesn't need to be announced. The kind of power that simply is. And somewhere, beyond the glittering lights of the city, a man walked alone, unconcerned with the waves he had left in his wake. He had not come for recognition, nor had he sought to prove a point. He had only come for dinner. The lesson had been an unintentional side effect, but one that would not be forgotten. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more like it. Share this video with others who might find it interesting, and check out more of our content for stories that challenge perspectives and leave a lasting impact. See you in the next one.